Hello and welcome once again. Today we're going to be talking about drugs and in particular how teen mental health influenced or affected by drug use. Very important topic that we're going to be discussing in this video. One of the first things we really want to discuss here is what's going on inside the brain when anybody uses drugs. Second, why would anybody turn to drugs in the first place? And then what are the consequences of that decision making? How's it going to impact them? And then how does it influence the risks of increased levels of anxiety, depression? Is there a connection there? And then recovery, right? So they went down this path. Is it possible to recover? How do we go about recovering and repair the mental health? So all those topics is what we'll be covering in this video. As we all know, teenage brains are going through all kinds of changes. There's lots of neurological connections happening internally. Hormones and other chemicals are being amped up. And teenage years can be a real struggle on that level. All these feelings and emotions and conflicting feelings can come about. That's natural. When teenagers begin to start experimenting with drugs, the natural interference of the production of these drugs and the wiring, the human experience of what's going on through natural processes, experiences, gets interfered with because you are beginning to flood the brain, the body, with like dopamine, which is a pleasure-enhancing chemical. And whether it's amphetamines or marijuana use or opiates, your body's getting an influx of that. So in that moment, they're beginning to feel better about themselves. They're just feeling better overall. That high can be different depending on the drug, but regardless, that high is a positive experience for the person, and that sets up this kind of cycle as they begin to want that more, and they reach for that more. And that's how the addictions can begin to happen. All along is also interfering now with some of the natural production. So the excitement that you might get through athletic competition or performing or just experiencing life in general can be interfered with from these drugs. And it can have a negative impact on the actual development of the brain, as well as setting up a addictive cycle, neither of which are positive. So that's kind of what's going on at the level of the cellular level inside the brain and inside the body. There are so many different reasons that as teenagers, anybody will turn to drugs. It typically starts in teenage years, so that's one thing we want to look at. It could be what's going on in the family. Self-medication, avoiding the stress and the anxiety that they're feeling, trying to self-medicate for depression, ADHD, and that diagnosis sometimes go undiagnosed in people who have that reached for drugs. Peer pressure, wanting to fit in, the lack of self-confidence, lack of self-love, all of these things, they all can factor in. The more of those kind of factors that play in, the more likely it is somebody may reach for the drugs, right? So if you have a child who's in a family unit, there's a lot of conflict and there's drug use and alcohol use within that family, and they have all this anxiety and stress and depression, and they don't feel good about themselves, they don't love themselves, they want to fit in with their peer groups. You put all that together, it's a recipe for disaster when it comes to drugs. And I interviewed somebody not too long ago on my podcast who became a drug addict. 12 different times he OD'd and had to be resuscitated. He spent 3 different times checks in prison. He was deeply addicted. In fact, the last time he went into prison, he said he had one goal, was to get better at being a criminal so he didn't end up back in prison. He wanted to learn from the other people there so that he could deal his drugs and do his drugs outside more successfully. Well, at that last stint in prison, though, something changed in him, changed his life, changed the direction of his life. He finally began to get the help. Today, He's a successful entrepreneur who has just started another successful company. He's been clean for over 6 years. It's a great, remarkable story about both what can lead you down that path. In his case, it was all those risk factors that I already mentioned. He had them all. And what we can do to right the ship. So that story, Jared's story, exemplifies some of the emotional, physical, psychological, economic consequences of drugs and alcohol. He started with alcohol, went to marijuana, then he started getting into the heavy opiates and heroin, and it just went down that path. Prison terms, bad health, broken relationship, daughter he never really knew because of all the time he spent in prison. All these things that he shared in my podcast are a perfect example of the negative consequences of drug and alcohol use. I have had former students who grew up in families that had long histories of drug and alcohol abuse and poverty and bad health, dying young. All those are common in any families with that kind of abuse and that kind of history. It's clear that if you go down that path and you don't change, you could very easily end up on the streets. There's way too many examples that I can share with you of all those things happening. So the negative consequences, I think we all know them. Right? We see them portrayed sometimes in some of the crime shows, and we read the statistics, we hear about them. It really is important to make sure they sink in and understand that it doesn't make your life better at all. It makes things worse. It's a great way to end up almost literally in the gutter. It is very clear that drug abuse creates lots of problems within the brain that contribute to and escalate depression and anxiety. Those who often start reaching for that as an escape of stress and the negative feelings that they're experiencing actually just make it worse. They kind of get this downward spiral as the drugs make worse any chemical imbalance that may have been there to begin with. And that chemical imbalance just kind of perpetuates this problem. Things like THC, which is in marijuana, has been shown to lead to gradual cognitive decline and also psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. All right, so even the so-called innocent drug of marijuana has a lot of negative consequences that influence mental health. So it's incredibly important to understand that any sort of these drug issues that you're dealing with a mind has some very serious potential negative consequences for depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders. First and foremost, let's talk about preventive. To prevent the likelihood or to diminish the likelihood someone might reach for drugs, you start with mindset training. And that begins at an early age, but even by the time they reach middle school and pre-tweens into teenage years, you can much more formalize. They're old enough at that point to really kind of go through more of a structured mindset training thing where they are going to deal with limiting beliefs they have, deal with some of the understanding their values, the decisions they've made, all these kind of things that have a root into, or potential root into, deciding to reach for drugs and to go down that road. The self-esteem, self-image, dealing with all of that, as well as also building habits around emotional management, building then positive beliefs, positive character traits. That's all goes into mindset training. That is probably the greatest antidote for preventing that. Now, if they've already gone down that road and they need recovery, well, therapeutically, you're still dealing with a mindset. You're still going to deal with a lot of those things. There's a lot of different tools, a lot of different therapies out there. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a big one. I actually think timeline therapy along with cognitive behavioral therapy, when you put those tools together, have a tremendous benefit. But we're also, by the time they've gone down that road, you're now also dealing with some of the physical aspects and the physical addictions. So all that would need to be addressed on that road to recovery. Ultimately, for them to stay in recovery mode, that mindset. And some of those same things I talked about doing preventively, they need to be in place again to help prevent relapse and to be able to manage life going forward, given that history and all of that. So that's really what people need to be able to do to recover and can do. Well, thank you for watching this whole video. We've come to the end of yet another one. And as always, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel, check out other videos, check out my podcast. Maybe that podcast with Jared Colby that I mentioned in this would be a great one to listen to. I'd also encourage you to subscribe or to register for my free webinar, Emotional Hygiene. The link to that will be in the description. So go check that, register that out and look at that today.